Hey everybody, welcome back to Hill and Ponton's YouTube channel. I'm Nate, the video guy. They still have not yet updated my title. I've been asking to get cool video guy, but I don't think they're going to budge on that one. And today I'm joined once again with Dr. Alexander Williams, or Alex for short, and we're going to talk about mental health DBQs. How you doing, Alex?
Nate, it's good to see you, and I will call you Cool Video Guy Nate, even if that's not the official title yet.
That's my way of getting back because I think I am cool video guy Nate, and I think it applies really well.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
So today we're going to go through mental health DBQs. Is there anything important about the DBQs we should know before we dive in?
I think as we go through, it hopefully will be clear to folks. But two things I would note up front. If you're going in for a mental disorders compensation and pension exam, this is the form that is filled out. Every psychologist, psychiatrist in the country is filling out some version of this form when you see them for an exam. I would also note it's publicly available. So we're going to walk through it today. But then later, if you're like, hey, I want to download a copy for myself to review, you can do that. You can Google mental disorders DBQ. It's probably the first link or one of the first links that comes up. It's readily available to you.
And we'll have that link in the description too. So you don't have to worry about hopping away. You can just click below and we'll get it nice and easy for you.
Okay, so you see at the very top, this is the Disability Benefits Questionnaire, the DBQ, that is filled out for anyone who is getting an exam for any mental health problem other than PTSD or an eating disorder. Down below, where you see where it says Section 1 Diagnosis, that's where the particular diagnosis that you receive is going to go if you have a mental health diagnosis. Now, you may be, emotionally, you may be tied to a certain diagnosis that, like, okay, I know that I have clinical depression. And so my diagnosis, I know it's major depressive disorder, or I know my diagnosis is generalized anxiety disorder. There are hundreds of diagnoses in the DSM-5. That's just a book that psychologists and psychiatrists use for making diagnoses. For the purposes of getting service connection, the exact diagnosis doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether you have one mental health diagnosis or 20. It's really about how it's affecting your life and your social life, your work life, that type of thing. So this is where the diagnosis goes, but I would say, don't be too hung up on the exact particulars of the diagnosis, because again, the exact which diagnosis out of those hundreds that it is or how many doesn't really ultimately impact the type of service connection you get.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's something that's been brought up by the attorneys a lot. Don't get hung up on what specific diagnosis you get. Understand that you're doing this for the mental disorder disability diagnosis.
That's correct. Exactly. Yes. So if we go on then to the next page of the Disability Benefits Questionnaire for Mental Disorders, going down to that section 1B, and it's kind of in the middle of the page there, it says medical diagnoses relevant to the understanding of the management of the mental health disorder. Okay, that's a mouthful. This is where if you have any sort of physical health condition that is related to your mental health condition, that's where it goes in this box. Parenthetically, in the little parentheses there, it says to include TBI. So if you have a traumatic brain injury, that would be noted in this box. If you have a mental health condition secondary to a physical health condition, so if you have anxiety because of maybe your tinnitus and you're service connected already for tinnitus, tinnitus will go in that box. If you've developed a physical health condition secondary to a mental health condition, maybe you have sleep apnea and you have sleep apnea because of your depression, sleep apnea or obstructive sleep apnea would go in that box. So that's where those physical health conditions get listed.
And part of the reason we're going over this is because if you know this ahead of time, you can be prepared going into the CNP exam. Instead of being blindsided by these questions, you now know, oh, I should be paying attention to the physical things that are caused secondary to my mental health diagnosis. And you can go in with a preparation of notes specifically for when that question comes up. You can already be prepared and say, well, here are the things that I've found that are secondary connected physical conditions to my mental health diagnosis, and already have them listed instead of the stress of trying to think of them in the moment sometimes.
That's a beautiful point, Nate. Yes, I should have said that up front. I mean, ultimately, that's the most helpful thing about going over this is it just helps you be prepared. Now, if you give that information to the person doing the exam, don't be shocked if some of that doesn't appear there. Sometimes they may be limited in terms of what they can list in that box if there isn't already something in your medical record. So like when you visited the doctor before, if it's not already documented in there, they may not be able to put in that box.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's also the case that psychologists and psychiatrists, when they're doing these exams with you for mental disorders, they can't diagnose that physical health condition. So there's nothing wrong with saying, I have sleep apnea and I think that it's because of my depression, but they can't give you a diagnosis of sleep apnea when they're filling these boxes out.
It's a good thing to know.
So the next part here, differentiation of symptoms. Does the veteran have more than one mental disorder diagnosed? Is it possible to differentiate what symptoms are attributable to each diagnosis? Okay, so let's say that you do have multiple mental health problems. Let's say that you have major depressive disorder and you have generalized anxiety disorder. In shorthand, people sometimes say, oh, I have clinical depression and clinical anxiety. Okay, so as a psychologist or the psychiatrist, based on reviewing your medical records, so your doctor's visits and the notes from those, can we tell which of your symptoms are caused by your depression, which by your anxiety? A lot of times it may be really difficult to tell. Let's say that you had one of those conditions was diagnosed prior to your military service, and there isn't really evidence that it got worse in the service. Then it's important because for service connection reasons, what the VA wants to see is that it was from your military service. The problems you're having now are because of a condition that worsened or was caused by your military service, not something from before the service. The other part is, let's say that you have multiple conditions, but maybe one of them has been in remission, that you haven't been affected by it for a long time. So let's say that you used to have a problem with alcohol. The term we use for that in mental health is an alcohol use disorder. But let's say that, yeah, you used to drink too much for a year or two, but that was 10 years ago, and you're still having problems now with your mental health. In that case, we might say you do have a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder, but that's been in remission. That's not been a problem for years. So the problems you're having now are probably due to your depression because that's still something that's in your life right now. On the next page here, at the bottom of this third page, you see these indicators for occupational and social impairment. So this is in part going to indicate how much the psychologist or the psychiatrist believes that your problems are causing difficulties in your life, difficulties socially for you, and difficulties in the workplace for you. Or if you're not working, how much would they be affecting your ability to work right now? The phrasing on there, you see there's everything from no mental disorder diagnosis, and then as you go down, it kind of increasingly gets worse in terms of how much these problems are affecting you. Each of those statements, too, also corresponds to a certain degree of service connection. I want to be clear, the psychologist, the psychiatrist doing the exam doesn't determine your service connection. And even which box they check here doesn't determine your service connection. But it's good to keep that in mind, right? So total occupational and social impairment, the bottom box, that would correspond to 100% service connection in terms of your mental health problems. If you look up to the second from the top, a mental condition has been formally diagnosed, but symptoms are not severe enough either to interfere with occupational and social functioning or to require continuous medication. In a case like that, you might still be service connected. That would correspond with 0% service connection. So your mental health problem was caused by your service perhaps, but it's not leading you to any degree of service connection beyond that acknowledgement.
That does make sense. I like that you noted that you aren't the ones deciding the rating. You're the one giving the information of like, here is, from my medical opinion, what is going on with the veteran. And then it's up to someone who is deciding the rating to do it. So it's not on you in that moment in the CMP exam to decide what percentage of rating. But because you've been doing this long enough, you know that that specific one will probably equate to about a 0% rating. And my assumption is that they'll increase as it goes down, depending on the severity of your mental health diagnosis.
That's exactly right. Items further down on the list correspond to a higher rating. But as you said, an understandable mistake that will come up is the veteran will assume that we, the psychologist or the psychiatrist doing the exam, are the ones who determine their service connection. Like say, oh, therefore you're going to get this much service connection or this much money or what have you. We don't make that decision. But again, I think that's an understandable mistake for folks to make.
Truly. Yeah. It is a very obfuscated process. That's for sure.
Here we have, again, questions about if there are occupational and social impairments. So if you're being impaired in your work and in your social life by your mental health conditions or by your TBI and your mental health conditions, again, can we tell which condition is responsible for these problems? We can't tell how much of it's from your depression, how much from your anxiety, but it's asking, can we tell, or is there any indicator of that? The bottom here, clinical findings onto the next page, is basically just our summary of reviewing your records. So I do exams for a contractor for the VA, and I do compensation and pension exams. I need to review your records prior to the exam, or if not prior, afterwards. I try to always do it before the exam. And I'm noting then significant findings in that box. So things that seem relevant to your mental health. When I look over your hundreds or your thousands of pages of medical records, I'm noting in there. If you pay for an exam, you can pay me and I will do an exam, and that can be something that you might be able to submit then to help your claim. But whether you use me or not, it's important that whoever you use is reviewing your records and noting that. And so you'll see sometimes people who get exams done through compensation and pension or on their own privately, and there isn't a review of records. And when you think about it from the VA's perspective, they want to see that whoever examined you was going over your medical history. Otherwise, think about all the things they would have difficulty talking about. Like, if I didn't review your medical records, think how hard it would be for me to know, well, did your depression start while you were in the service or after the service or before the service? If I haven't looked over your medical records, that's going to be especially difficult for me to suss out.
That's very important. Is there a way for someone to tell after their exam has happened whether or not that their medical records have been looked through? Can they request the copy of this afterwards?
Great question. If it's a private examiner that you're submitting as part of your claim, I would certainly ask them that. And then, yes, you should receive a copy from them of their exam, and there should be indicators that they reviewed your medical records. If not, I think it's very appropriate for you to ask them to do that. When you sit for a compensation and pension exam, the VA should not accept one that didn't have an indicator records were reviewed. Now, that being said, if I'm wearing my hat where I'm doing these exams with a VA contractor to do them, so you're sit for the compensation and pension exam, they should kick that back to me actually and ask me to review the records if I didn't have any indication that I had done so.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now, that being said, I think that the veterans can request this information after the exam, but I'm not sure how long of a process it takes to be able to get that exam copy or compensation and pension exam to you. But yes, hypothetically, you should be able to receive a copy of it afterwards. Okay, these next boxes on here, these are kind of the heart of the exam. So this is actually the part where most of the questions that the examiner will be asking you, the psychologist or the psychiatrist you're meeting with, this is what they'll be asking you about. They're going to be asking you about things like your social, marital, family history from before the service, from in the service, from after the service. So after the service is often, in some sense, the most important because, well, are these problems affecting you now? Like, right, are you having problems now socially because of your mental health problems? But the other parts are important too. So consider, like if you said, oh, today, I really have trouble making friends today. I just have trouble socializing with people. I don't want to be around anybody. If that was also true for you before the service and in the service, then it really seems like, well, that's probably just been something about your personality. I try to explain why I'm doing it, but then I'll have veterans ask me during the exam, well, wait a minute, why are you asking about my life growing up?
It helps to put together the full picture of everything that's going on.
Exactly. We're required to ask about these things, and it helps us to get the full picture. So again, if you're doing a compensation and pension exam, the examiner is required to ask about that. If they never asked about anything related to that, the VA should kick the exam back to them or not accept that exam that they submitted. If you're getting a private exam, it's important to make sure who's ever doing the exam covers those topics because the VA will not consider that as good of evidence if those things were not covered. The next box on there is occupational and educational history. Same type of thing. So they want to know what have you been doing work-wise, sometimes before the service and then in the service, after the service. What about education? So if I said my mental health problem has been really affecting my life, and at the same time, I'm balancing a stock portfolio and I'm traveling the world and booking international vacations, right? But you see, though, why the VA would be looking at that then a little more skeptically. They'd say, well, wait a minute, if this person's so impaired, how are they able to continue functioning at this high of an occupational level? The examiner would be asking you questions about what are your jobs that you've held from before the service, in the service, after the service. What's your performance been like on those jobs? Have you had difficulties with concentrating? Like, how is this affecting you currently? Is it different that maybe you didn't have difficulties concentrating before the service and now you do? Are you having trouble getting along with people at work? Have you ever been written up for anything? Have you been fired from jobs? Have you had to miss work? Looking for those signs of that you're having impairments, you're having problems functioning at work. Same thing with educational history. What's your highest level of education? Has it been affected? Maybe your educational journey was interrupted by your service, right? The VA is wanting to see how this is affecting your work life, how it's affecting jobs that you've held. Is it causing you problems at work? Now, a couple things to consider here. Some of you watching may be very high achieving people, and maybe even as a coping mechanism, you've thrown yourself into your work or you've thrown yourself into education, you've gotten a lot of advanced degrees, and you've gotten promoted at work. So in those cases, it's important to think about how is your mental health problems? Are they affecting your work in other ways? Maybe they're not. I think similarly that some people watching this, maybe they haven't worked in a while. And so in that case, I would try to focus more on when you last worked, how did these problems affect you? Or if you were to go back to work at the same type of job you were in before, how do you think these problems would affect you now?
It's also worth to note, like if you do have a job right now that gives you special exceptions because of your mental health, that's something to pay attention to. Of I work for a family-owned business that allows me to take a couple of days off if I'm not feeling mentally well, and I can come back and it doesn't affect my employment at all. They won't fire me over it because they're giving me special exceptions due to this. Is also another thing to keep in mind.
That's a wonderful example. Yes. I will talk to veterans who will say, no, I'm not in danger of losing my job. The reason I'm not in danger is because the owner understands I'm a veteran having these problems and they let me take off work as I need to. I would note that then. I would certainly bring that up if I were sitting for one of these exams. I would make sure the examiner knew that. Like, yeah, I'm having to miss work a lot. And the reason I'm not being fired is because I'm getting a special accommodation from the owner, not because, oh, I'm always at work every day, every day.
A lot of the things that you might overlook and think that it's not that important, it probably is more important than you think it is. So, being as thorough as possible is the goal here, even though you might be used to not telling everyone everything. The point here is to tell everyone everything, how you feel from small to big in these exams, because you want a complete picture of what's going on with you to get the most accurate rating.
That's exactly right. Nate, you and I have talked about this before, but a good examiner should be asking you a lot of questions that will hopefully bring that information out. But we can't count on every examiner being good. So when you go through the exam, if you're not getting this information out, it's good to have this information prepared. So if it hasn't come up, you can share it at that point.
Good point. It's a good point.
The next part here is about your mental health. This is both about treatments you've received, so psychiatric medication, if you've been in therapy or counseling. A lot of times as well here, your symptoms you're experiencing, like, oh, I'm feeling depressed, so I feel down a lot. I'm having trouble sleeping. I'm not eating well. I feel suicidal. Information like that would go in here too. So it's both very important, but in some ways, this part may actually be a little less important than some people assume. So it is definitely important. I would think about it ahead of time. I'd write it down. Like, what are the problems you're experiencing? How do you notice these things coming up in your life? It's not your job to know the technical terms and the medical terms, but like, oh, I feel my heart starts racing and I can't focus and I can't sleep. Write down how you notice these things affecting your life, right? In some ways, it might be a little less important than some people assume because ultimately, what the VA is looking at is not as much about how many symptoms you have, but about how those symptoms are negatively affecting your work and your socialization. So, how you interact with people, friends, family, strangers, that type of thing. It's not as much about, I have a list of symptoms. So, just to be clear, you definitely want to share with your examiner the symptoms you've had. As Nate said, even if it's something that's difficult to talk about, if at all possible, I would share it. I would write it down ahead of time if that will help sometimes to be able to share when it's something uncomfortable. But the rating is less about I have 50 symptoms and I haven't told the examiner how they affect my work and my social life. That's not going to go as far as I have 5 symptoms, but I've been able to really explain to the examiner how they've negatively affected my work, how they've negatively affected my family life. That's going to carry a lot more weight with the VA.
I like that point a lot.
After this is a part about legal and behavioral history. So I sometimes will talk about this part as in like, have you been arrested for things? Are you getting into fights with people? If not physical fights, are you getting into altercations that could have escalated to fights? Are you engaging in a lot of behaviors that some people might say are reckless? Maybe the speed limit is 40 miles an hour and you're consistently driving 90 miles an hour. Again, that information here from before your service, in the service, after the service. If we go into the next page, it talks about relevant substance abuse history. So here it would be talking about what types of substances have you used, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, other substances, right? Anything that you might think of here. It's important to share about if you've been use in general, I would share. But then beyond that, had there been periods of time when it's been negatively affecting your life? Like maybe I started feeling clinically depressed when I was in the service, and then after the service, as my depression worsened, I started drinking more. That would be important to share. It's important to get that timeline down so you're accurately conveying when these problems begin affecting you. The section after this, the symptom section. So this is something that the examiner would usually complete after the exam. It's a big list of symptoms. Some symptoms carry more weight than others, though. In general, something like having a flattened affect, you'll see that's midway down the page. That means that when you present to people, when you talk to people, that there's not much facial movement, that your emotions don't really vary, at least if we looked at your face as you're talking. And usually to be able to check that box, the examiner would want to see it not just in the exam, but see it in your medical records as well, that other people have observed that. Something like that may indicate more severe mental health problems than chronic sleep impairment. Now, chronic sleep impairment absolutely can be a problem, but just usually, typically, in general, that's a more mild mental health indicator of problems than something like having a flattened affect. Some of these as well, the plain language reading of them may not be the same thing as what the examiner can check or not check. There's items on there like impairment of short and long-term memory. For example, retention of only highly learned material while forgetting to complete tasks. Now, you might read that and think, well, wait a minute, I forget to complete tasks. I probably would qualify for that. That probably would describe me. And then you get the exam afterwards and the examiner hasn't checked that. The reason is on some of those memory items, it's going to require that you have a documented history of something like a traumatic brain injury or some type of organic, I'll say quote unquote, organic memory problem like dementia. Okay. If we're forgetting tasks or forgetting to do things at work or at home, that can really be a problem, but it's probably not that type of memory problem unless, again, we're talking about that you have dementia or you have a traumatic brain injury, something like that. If the examiner checks that and you don't have those things, the VA would often look askance at that. That's not something that they like to see. And it may give less credibility to the exam as a whole.
That's a good thing to know.
Behavioral observations come next. So just kind of what the examiner noticed about your behavior during the exam. Did you seem anxious? Did you seem depressed? I would encourage you, if you're watching this, a lot of times sitting for these things can be anxiety provoking. I would just try to be as you are. There can be the temptation sometimes like maybe I should try to act differently. I wouldn't try to act worse than you normally feel. I wouldn't try to act better than you normally feel. I would just try to present how you normally are. This is where the examiner may have more comments. When I do exams with folks, I'll oftentimes for compensation and pension exams at the beginning, kind of walk them through again, like, here's why we're meeting. Here's what I can do today. Here's what I can't do today. So, I can do this exam with you, but even though I'm a psychologist, I can't provide mental health treatment today. Things like that would be documented there. But you also may get documentation if you do testing, like they have you fill out some questionnaires for them about your mental health symptoms. They may note the results of those questionnaires there. So remarks can end up featuring a lot of different kind of diverse types of content at the end of the exam. That's the last page, and maybe beyond some things at the bottom where just the examiner's credentials go in. We've walked through the part of the exam.
The main takeaways are come in prepared. Make sure that you are going over this to know what's going to be talked about so you can have that already. Write it down if you need to bring it in with you. If you don't normally dress to the nines, this is not an opportunity for you to get all dressed up. If you're normally disheveled and have a hard time putting yourself together, show up the way you normally show up. Like just be you, and then share as much information as you can from small to large details, which is understandably difficult to do, especially if it seems like it's something negative you're going through. But those are what I took as the key takeaways of like, hey, make sure that this is how you're prepared for the exam.
I think those are great takeaways. Yes, present like you normally present. I agree with everything you said there about write things down, particularly for things that are hard to talk about. That can make it a little easier if you already have something written down. And remember to focus on noting your symptoms, like I'm having trouble sleeping, I feel anxious. That's good. But even better, in many times, is noting how these problems are hurting your life when it comes to your work and when it comes to how you relate to people like your family or friends or just people in the world in general.
And quick question, when you do exams, how often are other people in the room with the veteran, like a spouse or a close friend or something to help with that?
I'd say that it happens maybe 15% of the time. I'll usually check with the veteran. I'll just say, are you okay with so and so being in the room with you right now, their spouse or child or a friend or whoever. Examiner's not required to allow that. It's kind of up to their discretion, so it's their choice. Some examiners may not allow that. There's nothing wrong if you feel more comfortable with having somebody there, either on video or if you're in person, having them come with you in person. Just be prepared. The individual examiner may say that they have to wait in the waiting room. I'm okay with it, but it kind of varies by examiner.
For those of you watching, if you really enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up. We want to keep making more of these. This is the first of many DBQ videos. If there's already another one out, you'll be able to click that video probably somewhere around here to watch the next DBQ video. If not, there's another video on our channel that you can check out for more information on this. Thank you so much. How can people reach out to you if they want to hit you up to see if you're available for a CMP exam?
So if you go to disabledveteranbenefits.com, there's a contact us form. You can reach out. I'm happy to answer questions you have, or if you're interested in a private exam or a Nexus letter, I'm happy to help with that.
Awesome. We're going to have that linked below, as well as a free consultation with Hill and Ponton if you'd like. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you for your service, and have a wonderful day.